Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs, no we don't.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, big episode 50! I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host today, Ken Fader, and today we're talking with Jennifer Raff. Jennifer works with genetics in the field of archaeology, and she's going to tell us today a little bit about what haplogroups have to do with archaeology, how we can use them to chart gene flow from across Europe and into the United States, and what that mysterious haplogroup X means. Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do...
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I'm here with Ken. Ken, how's it going?
It's going hot, Sarah. It is miserably, terribly off. It's like living inside of a sweat sock here in Connecticut today.
It is nasty. The heat is
horrible. It's very nasty.
But today we have a special guest. We have Jennifer Raff with us, and she is going to talk about archaeology and genetics, which is a big topic I've gotten a lot of requests for lately. Jennifer, how's it going?
It's good. It's also really, really hot here in Kansas.
Man.
Yeah.
So you're at the University of Kansas?
Yeah, I'm at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. And thanks so much for having me on. This is great. I'm very excited about it.
Thank you for coming on. Kansas, I once drove cross country, and Kansas is so flat. I swear that when I entered one end, like the east end of Kansas, you can see the west end of Kansas because it's just that flat. The road goes straight through, no mountains, nothing in your way. That was my impression of Kansas.
There's non-flat parts. My office is at the top of a hill, and I can see all through the Kaw Valley, which is really cool. It's a tiny little office, so that's my compensation, is I get a beautiful view. But for the most part, it's pretty flat, at least around here. So,
is Kansas the state that the Purdue University proved was actually topologically flatter than a pancake? Because they made like a bunch of pancakes and then measured them. They seriously. And then they compared it to an actual topography map of the state, and they found that an average pancake has more elevation, has more variation than the state of Kansas.
Good God, your tuition dollars at work.
I don't trust any IU grads say, because I am an IU grad. So,
there you go. When did you graduate from IU?
Wrong. So, 2008.
Oh, that's awesome. That was like 2 years after I graduated. Yay!
Wait, were we in the same class? We couldn't have been in the same classes. I would have remembered.
Did you go to Bloomington or did you go to IUPUI?
Bloomington.
Then no, we weren't in the same classes.
Okay, that makes sense then. Okay. I was feeling bad for a second.
No. Yeah, I know. I was trying to your name sounded familiar, but I didn't go to the Bloomington campus. I went to the Indianapolis campus. So.
Okay. Fellow Hoosier.
Cool.
Yeah,
So, Jennifer, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your research and your background, so our listeners will know where you're coming from.
Sure. So I'm an anthropological geneticist, which is a mouthful, but it basically means I'm a geneticist who works on human prehistory using methods from anthropology, from biology, from a bunch of different disciplines that sort of all intersect. And so I study the genomes of ancient and modern peoples in order to reconstruct their past population histories. So a lot of people in my field tend to pick either ancient DNA or modern DNA to work on, but I kind of like to do both. So, and I'm wrapping up my first year as an assistant professor at the University of Kansas. And so I'm teaching and doing research here, and my research mostly focus on a couple of big questions: the peopling of the Americas, the initial peopling of the Americas, and the subsequent population history in some regions of the Americas. I've worked in the Midwest, and I've worked in Texas, and then I've done a lot of work more recently up in the Arctic. And so I study the prehistory of the Arctic and the Aleutian Islands as well.
Very cool. So
that's amazing, yeah.
So how are you getting these genetic samples? Just to jump straight in.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it depends. I work with up in the Arctic, especially. I've gone up there for a couple of seasons, and we were there at the request of the Inupiat elders in Barrow. They requested our team to come out there and help them locate the remains of people who they believed were their ancestors, who were right on the tip of Point Barrow. These burials were eroding into the Arctic Ocean because of climate change was pushing the coast back. And so the Inupiat community in Barrow believed that, well, if our ancestors had wanted to be buried at sea, they would have been buried at sea. And so they think it's most appropriate that they be buried inland. And so they asked Ann Jensen, who's an archaeologist up in Barrow, to locate the burials. And as part of that, they gave us permission to study them, and they gave us some interesting questions to study. One of them being, we believe these are our ancestors. Can you confirm that? And I was actually not the PI on that project. I was a postdoc at the time, working with Dennis O'Rourke, who's actually now at the University of Kansas also, which is awesome. And he agreed, and so we took on this project. And my job was to go out, and every time they found a burial, I would kick everybody off the site, excavate a rib, and bag it and take it back. So that's one way we get samples. And in the course of the consultation for this project, an elder in the community said, "Hey, if you're studying these remains, why don't you study us as well?" And so we're like, okay. So my other PI, who's also my postdoc mentor, Jeff Hayes at Northwestern University, put together a project to study the modern genomes of the people in the North Slope, Barrow, and a couple of other villages around the area. So we've been working on this really big project for several years now, looking at ancient DNA, which is headed by Justin Tackney, who's now my postdoc, which is kind of fun, and then so me working on the modern stuff. So
cool.
Yeah.
Now, for the sake of our audience, I don't know, the folks listening to the podcast, I don't know how familiar they are with genetic analysis or with the distinction between nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. So if you could, like the real super quick, just make that distinction, make that definition. What's advantageous of looking at nuclear? What's advantageous of looking at mitochondrial? And in the study that you were just talking about, the bone study, are we talking about mitochondrial DNA or nuclear DNA?
Right. Okay. So mitochondrial DNA is a separate genome inside of your cells, separate from the nucleus. And mitochondrial DNA is inherited strictly maternally. So your mitochondrial lineage is inherited from your mother and her mother and her mother and her mother and so on. That gives you an idea, if you look at it, of your maternal history.
Right.
But your maternal history is only one very tiny sliver of your overall ancestry. And so if you want to get a bigger picture and understand what more of your ancestors were doing in the past, you also need to look at the nuclear genome. And that includes your Y chromosome, which is, of course, only inherited paternally. And I don't have one, so yeah. So anyway, the reason we like mitochondrial DNA is because it gives you this unbroken line of ancestry. It doesn't mix with parts of the nuclear genome, at least the regions we study. So it makes it computationally really easy to study. And it's preserved the best in ancient contexts because there are hundreds and hundreds of copies of mitochondria per cell, each with a mitochondrial genome, whereas with the nuclear genome, you've only got 2 per cell. And so in an ancient context, you're much more likely to recover mitochondrial DNA than you are for nuclear. And so historically, mitochondrial DNA has been sort of the target of ancient DNA studies the most. But now we have some really great methods for recovering and analyzing tiny, tiny bits of the nuclear genome in ancient contexts. And so the whole field is kind of undergoing this transition where we're moving to more and more and more nuclear genome studies as well.
It's interesting. As the only person in this conversation with a Y chromosome, I want to point out that it's a real pain in the ass, and it's been the source of many issues in my life. So, listen, you ain't missing anything, let me tell you.
So, Jennifer, you're talking about the mitochondrial DNA, and I watched an amazing video that Ken was actually part of, but then removed from. I believe it was what was the name of that again? Ancient America?
Oh my God, Lost Civilizations of America.
The Lost Civilizations of America. Have you watched it?
Deborah was involved in that as well, and I think she was probably the person who was the most grievously misused in that.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So we're...
Yeah.
I heard they selectively edited the things you guys said.
Oh, it was bad.
It was a nightmare. Yeah, it was a nightmare. So, Jen, one of the things that people are aware of is that there are a certain limited number of mitochondrial. What's a haplogroup?
Right.
And why do people reading about this stuff say, "Oh yeah, there are 5 haplogroups in America," and then we can get after the break we can talk about why are there people saying that one of those haplogroups is sourced to Southwest Asia. But so what are haplogroups, and what are the haplogroups in North America among Native Americans?
Yes. So a haplogroup, you can kind of think of it as almost a little family tree. It's a collection of maternal mitochondrial lineages that are closely related by sharing the same ancestor. And so we kind of, if you think of, I don't know if you guys think of phylogenetic trees at all in archaeology,
Sure.
But you do that also. You do that in when you're looking at ancient hominins, for example, right? So if you think about mitochondrial lineages as being analogous to ancient hominin species, right? A haplogroup might be a collection of hominins that share a closely related last common ancestor. So the genus Homo or whatever, right, would be like one of the haplogroups.
Sure.
It's not a really great analogy, but it kind of helps. So, and in the Americas, there are, there's actually more than 5 because there are some sub-haplogroups and it gets complicated. But there are a limited number of haplogroups, and we tend to fall under the names A, B, C, D, and X.
Right.
So who is this infamous? Because, all right, so you're familiar with the Solutrean hypothesis, and Ken and I have talked about that on the show.
Yes. And
haplogroup X was also a major player in Lost Civilizations of Ancient America. The push for that was somehow that haplogroup proves that everyone came from a white heritage. So can you explain to me why that's not correct?
Yes, I can. It'll take some time.
That's fine. We've still got plenty of time.
Okay, so haplogroup X in the Americas is actually haplogroup X2A, and then there's another one called haplogroup X2G, but it's very, very rare. So let's not talk about that because it gets complicated. But X2A is a mitochondrial haplogroup that's only found in North America. It's not found in South America or Central America, at least not yet. It may be someday, but for now, all we've seen it in is North America. And what's interesting about X2A is that its parent haplogroup, X2, right? You can think of it as not parent, but more like great grandparents, right? So this would be like, I don't know, maybe Homo erectus versus Homo sapiens, right? So Homo erectus would be X2 or something. And anyway, X2 is found distributed in low frequencies in a very wide geographic area, which encompasses the Middle East, it encompasses Eurasia, and X2 descendants have also been found in Europe.
Now, when you say low frequency, what are you referring to there? I'm going to ask you a lot of simplifying questions. Sorry.
That's fine. No, that's fine. Yeah, and please stop me if I'm unclear about something. As a percentage of the overall makeup of a population. So we talk about haplogroup frequencies, like the percent of A in a population, haplogroup A, and we could compare the percentage of haplogroup A in one population to another, and that's a sort of a way of saying, okay, these two populations are more similar to each other.
So you're saying that haplogroup X2, it does not occur frequently in the old world, and
it doesn't occur frequently anywhere.
Okay.
But yeah, it's at very, very low frequencies. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I'm thinking it's like 2% or less, something like that, in various regions throughout Europe and Eurasia. And what's important is it's not just X2, but it's derived lineages from X2. There are a bunch of lineages like in the Near East which have their own private mutations that set it apart from sort of the parent haplogroup. In the Near East, to see like haplogroup X2G, these like cousin haplogroups, right? If you think about it as a family tree, these are like second cousins that are distributed all around all around Eurasia. Whereas X2, the grandparent haplogroup, is found also very low frequencies, right?
Okay.
So for a while, we were not able to type the haplogroups very precisely. And what I mean by that is we couldn't sequence the whole genome, the whole mitochondrial genome. We just didn't do that. And by we, I mean the whole field. But as you begin to have the technologies available to sequence the entire mitochondrial genome, you identify variants that let you classify lineages into more and more precise ways. So you can say, oh, this lineage over here is related very, very closely to the one, 1,000 miles away. And we can maybe retrace migrations by looking at the patterns of mutations over geographic space.
Okay.
So, So I hope is that clear?
Oh no, yeah, that's much clearer. A good chunk of our listenership are not academics, so I like to break things down so that my mother could understand them.
Totally.
Nothing against my mother. My mother's very intelligent. She just isn't into this. So anyway, okay. So haplogroup X, you're saying, or haplogroup X2 occurs very rarely in general, and so how? So haplogroup X2 occurs over in the Europe area, Eurasia, in that area, but it also occurs here in North America and just North America that we have found so far?
Yeah, so haplogroup X2A, which is a granddaughter lineage, maybe you might say, of X2, is found in North America. And when it was originally found in North America, because we couldn't look at all the mutations, right? We could only look at a small number of them. We had sort of a cruder estimate of how things were related to one another. And that kind of left the field open for people saying, oh, this is the same lineage that we see in Europe, right? Even though it is distinguished by more mutations. And so people speculated that perhaps X2 came to the Americas from Europe as a sort of transatlantic crossing, right? And that's where they get that support for this Lutrian hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
There's more to it than that, but that was kind of the initial story.
I have a question, Jenny. So are we at a point, and is this even a reasonable question, where when we look at the differences in these kind of sister groups, can we tell how long they've been separated based on how many different mutations they have?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
With some caveats.
Sure.
Right. So, yeah. The main caveat being how fast, this is called the molecular clock.
Right,
Is how fast does the clock tick? And there are many people who will argue quite a bit over how fast the clock ticks, or what is the rate at which these lineages accumulate new mutations.
Right.
But what we know from the best estimates that we have right now is that the North American X2A coalesces or shares a last common ancestor with the other X2s at about 14,000 years before present. And it shares a last common ancestor with X2 itself, the old great-grandmother lineage, about 22,000 years before present.
Right. Those are both really lovely dates for an archaeologist, because they are at least ballpark, order of magnitude, with the dating of some of the earliest archaeological sites in North America. So if those dates were 1,000 years ago, that would be bad. If your dates were 1,000,000 years ago, that would be bad. But 14,000, 20,000, those are at least at this level of analysis. Those conform with what the archaeological record is showing us.
Right. And it's my understanding that the coalescence dates for all of the mitochondrial lineages found in North America was one of the pieces of evidence that first caused archaeologists to question the sort of Clovis first model.
Right, sure.
So it kind of, it was an independent test, I guess, of the model. And so that's kind of nice that, I think archaeology and genetics are extremely complementary fields of study. And, each field can really build on the strengths of the other.
Oh, absolutely. Now, off the top of your head, do you know the human skeletons with great antiquity found in North America, have all of those skeletons have been sequenced? So the Anzac child, do we have a haplogroup for that child? For some of the skeletons in Florida, in the sinkholes, have those been typed?
Some of them have, some of them haven't. We definitely have haplogroups for Anzac. We have haplogroups for Kennewick man, which is really important to the story. And some of the others, really older ones that were studied during the early days of anthropological genetics, we don't have haplogroups for all of those, but we have some for some.
Okay, well, let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about what the Solutrean hypothesis is and the Clovis first model.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
And we are back, and we are still talking with Jennifer Raff about genetics and how they apply to archaeology. So, Ken and I have talked about the Solutrean hypothesis before, and you brought up the Clovis first model. Ken, can you tell us what the Solutrean hypothesis is? And Jennifer, can you then tell us what the Clovis first model is?
The deal with this is that, look, we know that even as far back as the 1920s and 30s, big controversy about the timing of the first human entry into the New World. And it really wasn't until, late 30s and early 40s, when Folsom Point was found in the body of the bone of an extinct bison, and the realization was that people were here before the end of the Pleistocene. They were here and hunting animals that we knew became extinct 10,000 years ago. And with that, as more and more skeletons were found, animal skeletons with fluted points, and then when radiocarbon dating was introduced in the early 1950s. The model was, look, we've got people in the New World, tail end of the Pleistocene. They're hunting megafauna. That's maybe 12,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, and that became the dominant paradigm, that those were the first people to enter into the New World. All along, there were these other kind of outlier sites that, maybe they were artifacts and maybe they were natural, and maybe the dates were good and the dates were bad. This is going on for decades. And it's really only in the last, 20 years that good, solid evidence has been brought forth, has been presented to show that, we really do have radiocarbon dates, good solid dates, good stratigraphic controls, bones of extinct animals, clearly artifactual materials that go back as much as 15 or even 16,000 years ago. The Deborah L. Freakin site in Texas, excavated by Michael Waters, is a great example of that. They've got solid, good radiocarbon dates. The layer is pre-Clovis. It's under Clovis. Well, all this is going on, and Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stamford began doing this research. And by the way, the original suggestion of a Solutrean migration from Paleolithic Europe into the New World goes back even in the 1960s. I remember as a grad student in the 70s reading an article, I think the guy's name was Greenman, in Current Anthropology, in which he laid out this hypothesis that, you know what, that some of the big game hunters of the New World, their stuff looks a lot like the big game hunters, the artifacts in Paleolithic Europe and the late Ice Age Europe. And the suggestion was that these folks could have come to the New World. That kind of was laid aside for a while. And then Bruce Bradley is a preeminent lithic technologist, stone tool replicator, and Stanford is an archaeologist at the Smithsonian. Interesting guy, both brilliant men who put together, both among themselves, but there were some other folks involved. Again, they kind of resurrected the hypothesis that at least in the east coast of North America, the earliest settlers were not folks who walked in across the Bering Land Bridge from Northeast Asia into Northwest North America, but who had somehow managed by boats, bouncing from island to island, from iceberg to iceberg, sailed west across the Atlantic and settled in the New World 12, 13, 15,000 years ago. And I believe that Jenny, you and Deborah Bolnick wrote this wonderful article, which I believe we have already cited in the blog, and if not, we certainly will do it.
It'll be back in the show notes.
It'll be back in the show notes, right? Because now there are folks also saying, not just using these kind of outlier archaeological sites in the Northeast and looking at similarities in the lithic technology between Paleolithic Europe and Eastern North America, but saying there actually is physical, genetic, biological evidence that we have an influx of population from Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, they use this haplogroup X as their source of inspiration, or the thing that they base this on. So
that's right.
Our question to you is, what the hell? Is there anything behind that? And we're setting you up because we know what the answer is, but why don't you tell the audience from a biological anthropologist's perspective, from somebody who studies the genetics, what's good about that hypothesis and what's wrong with it?
Sure. Well, I think the good thing about that hypothesis is it is a hypothesis. We're not talking about pseudoscience here. These are legitimate archaeologists. You know, they're doing legitimate research, although I think the weight of evidence is very strongly against them, really, really strongly against them at this point. But be that as it may, you know, we're not dealing with pseudoscientists here. Okay, so that's a good thing. But what's wrong with their idea is, so first I should back up and try and explain a little bit more about what they're saying.
Sure.
Our paper was a response to another paper that came out by Bradley and Stanford and Bradley, and another author named Oppenheimer, who's a British geneticist, I believe. I don't really know him. And in which they said that haplogroup X was evidence for a transatlantic migration.
Right.
Or at least it was evidence that Native Americans did not derive all their ancestry from Beringia, or ancient Native Americans did not. And then they also included talk about the nuclear genome as well. And so I'll tackle haplogroup X first.
Sure.
The problem with their haplogroup X claim is that the lineages of X in Europe, as I mentioned earlier, they're not ancestral to the lineages in North America at all. Think of them, again, coming back to this family tree analogy, think of them as cousins. They're like the Neanderthals to our Homo sapiens, or even farther apart than that. Maybe they're the hobbits, right? Okay, so they're cousin lineages to us. They are not, or to the North Americans. They're not ancestral. The problem with understanding the evolution of the haplogroup X in North America is that we are simply missing transitional fossils. We do not have a clear ancestor for X2A in North America or in Siberia, where the other mitochondrial haplogroups derive from. Their ancestors are from Siberia. So you would predict that haplogroup X2A in North America, the ancestors to that haplogroup would also be in Siberia, but they haven't been found. But they haven't been found anywhere. And so this leaves the door wide open to all these speculations and these ideas. So there's no proof that haplogroup X2A evolved in Europe. At least nothing that they cite is evidence for that. So, I think that kind of settles that question for the moment. We have to look at other indirect sources of evidence to understand where X2A in North America comes from.
Like aliens?
I think that actually is a suggestion.
It is actually alien DNA, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no. We don't have evidence for being aliens either. We're just missing those transitional fossils between X2 and X2A. And I'm going to predict that those lineages will be found eventually, probably in ancient remains in Siberia, but we just don't have really great geographic coverage yet. So for me, and I'm gonna sort of cut to the chase here because I could talk about this for hours, and I know your listeners will probably be bored by it. But for me, the strongest piece of evidence that X2A has a similar origin to the other mitochondrial haplogroups is if you look at the genomes, the nuclear genomes of ancient individuals in North America who bear the X2A lineage, mitochondrial lineage. Their genomes, their nuclear genomes, show the same ancestry as all other nuclear genomes from Native Americans. So there's no evidence for any European-derived gene flow that way, or from anywhere else, really. So and finally, Oppenheimer et al. Look at sort of the geographic distribution of individuals with X2A in past populations, and they say, okay, well, we see them mostly around the Great Lakes region and sort of in Canada and Eastern Canada. And so that suggests to us that, well, really X2A, is actually coming from across the Atlantic because, that geographic pattern fits better that way. But in actuality, after the paper was published, the Kennewick man genome was published, and Kennewick man is not from the Great Lakes region or from Canada. He's really from the West Coast, and he had X2A was his mitochondrial genome, and actually not just X2A, but a very basal or very old version of X2A. Sure. It's the oldest ever found. So that puts the oldest X2A ever on the West Coast, which is much more in line with our current models of the initial peopling of the Americas being along the West Coast. So, right now the evidence is really strongly in favor of those models, and there's not a single scrap of genetic evidence supporting the Solutrean hypothesis.
So
we thought about it, we considered it, right? It's very important to say, what evidence would change your mind, right? And I could articulate it if we saw evidence of, pre-Columbus, European gene flow, but we just don't see it. So
just to recap a little bit, so you're saying that the haplogroup X2A is in Kennewick man, and he's the oldest one that we found in North America, and the location of Kennewick man puts the influx of this haplogroup, aligns it perfectly with the current models that we have of the peoplings of Americas, where they've come across Beringia and have come down the West Coast and then spread across, as far as we're aware right now, and spread across North America. And there's no evidence that haplogroup is being trickled in via Europe and that kind of thing.
Right. If there was, so you could, I have had people argue with me, well, maybe he just got haplogroup X from sort of gene flow across the continent, but that doesn't show any of the other markers in the genome in the nuclear genome. And I'm just like, that is so unlikely that you would have just your mitochondrial DNA and no signature in your nuclear genome whatsoever of that gene flow. I don't see that happening. So yeah, it's very, very strong evidence that there's no ancient European contribution whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm just saying it seems a really weak argument geographically to point to the Great Lakes and say we've got a lot of X2A there, so they must have come from Europe. I think a lot of X2A in the Great Lakes would suggest that they parachuted into the North America, because that's not the East Coast. That's kind of the middle of the country.
No.
So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either.
Yeah, and some people have said use the distribution of X2A, some geneticists have said, well, maybe that's evidence for, in fact, a interior migration.
Right.
Right, and that's also possible. I mean, we are pretty damn sure that the first migrations into the Americas were along the West Coast, but an interior, a migration down the ice-free corridor is certainly possible after that. And so some people point to X2A and say that's evidence of that migration. It's possible.
Cool. When you look at the map of the world of X2A, again, forgive my ignorance on this point. Can you look at that map and look at all the variations and say it would appear that X kind of originates here and spreds out from there, so that you could have, having X in Europe may mean that ancestrally that they come from someplace in Eurasia, and one direction they become Europeans, and the other direction they ultimately become Native Americans. But that's a long time ago.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, that's exactly what happened, I think.
Okay.
We see haplogroup X proper in Eurasia and North Africa. We see haplogroup X2, right? So the grandchild of haplogroup X, in Eurasia and North Africa. And then we see it spreading out through the Near East, through into the Middle East, in acquiring additional mutations as it differentiates. And in like West Eurasia, you see these cousin haplogroups, X2b, X2d, X2c, but you only see X2a in North America.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that haplogroup X is not a European haplogroup anyway. So you gotta think about it in terms of scale, right? So haplogroup X is the biggest scale, the biggest grouping, right? To which all these other sublineages belong, right? Haplogroup X is not European. It's found throughout Eurasia, throughout North Africa. X2A, similar, right? Its grandchild, its haplogroup is found similar distribution. And then you see more and more of these derived haplogroups, these younger lineages in different geographic locations. So it's like Ken and I said when we tackled the Solutrean hypothesis the first time, that as much as certain groups would like to believe that this haplogroup X proves basically white supremacy, it's not even a European haplogroup to begin with. So they're barking up the wrong tree in general.
They are. And in fact, the European, what we would think of as the white European sort of, gene pool didn't even evolve into until about 8,000 years ago, right? So there were migrations of people into what is now Europe, and the people who lived there before, the pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers, looked very different. So, genetically. So it just doesn't add up to this neat story that they're trying to tell.
And we don't see any of those genes in North America or anywhere on the Americas.
Yeah, that has been tested, explicitly. And we don't see any close relationship with pre-Columbian between Europeans and pre-Columbian North Americans or South Americans. Now, of course,
I just want to jump in and clarify one thing. There are two things we're talking about. Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley and Oppenheim are not white supremacists.
No. Good point.
They've got a notion, right? But there are people, and these are really super fringe people, who hear, oh, these guys say Europeans populated North America. That's white people. White people were here first. But we want to make that distinction between the scientists who may be wrong, and we think they're wrong, and the real nut job racists who completely misinterpret what those scientists say and make it into some, crazy, the whites were here, whatever. But we want to make that distinction.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I don't want anybody to read into that. I don't want anybody to read that into that. We're going after specific fringe groups here when we're talking about the genetics, and with the Solutrean hypothesis, that's a legitimate hypothesis that's being discussed amongst actual archaeologists for varyingly good reasons or varyingly bad reasons, but
we've always made the distinction in the podcast between wrong and crazy. The Solutrean hypothesis may be wrong. Those guys aren't crazy. No. There are some people. Well, if you guys remember when there was a group of like modern day Norseman in, I don't know if it was Wisconsin or Minnesota, who claimed ownership of Kennewick when the initial analysis of the morphology of the skull came out, and Chatter's kind of, I think he used the word Caucasoid,
yes,
or Caucasian. Mm-hmm. And so these guys say, he's our ancestor. This proves that white people were here first. Again, that's obviously now that the mitochondrial haplogroup has been determined for Kennewick, those guys can go home and they don't get to do their Norse prayers over the skeleton as they actually were allowed to do 10 years ago or whatever, because we now know, okay, that's a done deal. But again, that's a separate issue.
Yeah, that's a separate issue, and that was a very unfortunate event. And
yes.
I don't think the Troth and the Ace of Truth still claim Kennewick Man due to evidence.
Out yet.
Exactly. Yeah, but I remember when that happened, and it was an uncomfortable moment for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's really important, making the distinction between legitimate scientists who are actually asking legitimate scientific questions. It's and the sort of racist. That's a really important distinction to make. Another distinction maybe is sort of, there are fringe theorists out there who really, really object, who believe that we are calling them racist by pointing out that their efforts to invoke European participation in Native American history, when we say that's tying into a larger racial narrative that's been going on since the foundation of this country, and they think that we're attacking them personally as being racist, which is, I think it's more that they're not self-aware enough to understand that this is that narrative, that they're trying to insert Europeans into Native American history, and that how wrong and inappropriate that is. But
yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I don't think they're doing it with bad intention, and they're not like, neo-Nazis or anything like that. But I do see that happening a lot. And then they are very unhappy when you point this out, because they're like, I'm not racist. And we're like, well, maybe not. You don't think you are, but you're perpetuating this
racist
really
idea.
Untrue narrative. Yeah.
That's the problem with trying to make the distinction with people, especially fringe groups, where you have to bring that up, because you have to bring that up. But when you do, again, like you said, they think you're calling them a racist. And it's like, I'm not saying that you are racist. I'm saying the things that you are saying and the ideas that you are proposing are racist. And maybe you need to reflect on those. Yes, exactly.
You need to understand this story, this ugly story that's been a narrative in the history of American anthropology and American archaeology,
right? So
that, you don't accidentally prop it up, with your old ideas. Yeah.
Well, let's go to
the deal here is, I just give me like a minute when we come back from break.
Okay. Let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, Ken will have his minute, and we will tear into those home genetic tests, because I want to do that.
All right.
Kim Biddulph explores the books set in our prehistoric past on Prehistories, an innovative and creative show. Kim investigates the archaeology and anthropology behind your favorite stories by bringing on guests that are experts in the field and that can speak to the actual story behind the story. Check out the show at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/prehistories. Now let's get back to the show.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
And we are back, and Ken, you can have your minute. I'm timing you.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I just wanted to point out, and we don't make political statements on this show. That's cool. But the notion, this these claims about injecting white people into history and prehistory, and we're responsible for everything. That's not something minor or something on the fringes only. Very recently, a supporter of Donald Trump, and I'm not telling you who to vote for, Representative King, I believe is his name, actually said out loud in front of God and everybody that, it's the white race is really responsible for all the great things that have happened in this world. And, what have the other people ever accomplished? And, that's not, the guy's a nut. Okay, cool. But it's not like he's some dirtbag living in his mom's basement. This is a person in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yep.
So this issue, this concern, man, it's freaking pervasive. And it's not just at the little fringes of archaeology, man. It's everywhere. And if we can, in archaeology and biological anthropology, if we can fight that and say, listen, we've got the facts and we know that that's bullshit, and that's what we do on this show, I think that's a valuable thing for us to do. That was my minute. I'm done.
You actually kept that to a minute. I'm very impressed. So
awesome.
Let's talk about, we've danced around this before and Ken's brought it up a few times in passing, but let's talk about these home genetic tests where you prick your finger and you send in your little droplet of blood or whatever you do. I don't know. You send it in, they sequence your DNA, they send it back to you, and they tell you all the horrible things you're going to die from, but they can also apparently tell you your genetic lineage.
Right. And this is actually perfectly in line with what we've been talking about, because in one of these, we were talking about this before we went live, there's a woman talking about how she's always been told she is, Scottish, and she did the genetic test, and it turns out, and there's a very specific number, I am 26% Native American.
Right.
And the really tacky thing is that she's talking, and right behind her on a table is a beautiful Hopi pot and a beautiful Hopi Kachina, because the Hopi are the Indians.
Right.
Jen, so the question I have for you, Jenny, is where does such a thing, number one, where does that number even come from? And number two, what does it mean? Is there any legitimacy at all when somebody says, oh, the genetic test says I'm 26% Native American?
Right. Okay. So I have thoughts on this with a capital T. But before I start, can I ask everybody, all your listeners, to go check out the tweets and Facebook postings and blogs of a woman named Kim Tallbear, Tallbear is her last name, because she is doing some amazing writing critiquing this very thing, this conflation of genetics and identity, and white people trying to appropriate Native American identity and Native American tribal affiliations. So yeah, she's amazing. So you should just read what she has to say, because I could not say it better than her. But I'll do my best to try and summarize this.
Her name is, give us her name one more time.
Kim Tallbear.
Okay. Beautiful.
Yeah. And there are other really great people in the field working on this this issue as well. Also, my postdoc mentor from the University of Texas, Deborah Bolnick, who's the co-author with me on that article that we were talking about earlier, she does a lot of work on this as well. So where this is coming from is the genetic testing companies are taking genetic markers. So we would call mutations, but they're just genetic markers. And they're lining them all up and they're saying, where do we see these markers present in other populations, contemporary populations? And they're saying, okay, you, based on these markers, you are this percentage similar to this group who share this number of markers with you, and so forth. Okay. The problem with that is you are only, these results are only so good as the reference populations, right? So if they have a lot of participants and a wide geographic distribution, you can say, okay, I'm most closely similar genetically to the people from, let's say, Ireland, right? Or, New Zealand or wherever. But your listeners should know that not all of these genetic databases are the same, that each company has their sort of own proprietary database, plus whatever is freely available in the literature. So that's one caveat. Another caveat is that as we've been talking about, gene pools or change. So people who are in one area in the past, like in Europe, don't necessarily resemble what people look like genetically in that area today, right? So people move around, populations migrate, people evolve, a region, geographic region will look different over time. And so a lot of times these are relying on your similarity to contemporary populations. So if I may resemble genetically people who are in Russia, but my ancestors maybe came from Poland. And so what it's going to tell me is my ancestors came from Russia, not Poland, right?
Sure.
If there were lots of migrations. Okay, so that's caveat number 2. Then caveat number 3, which is the really big one for me, is that your ancestry is not your identity. And people say these things, they conflate them so much. You will see these genetic testing companies say, we will tell you who you are. And it's just, as an anthropologist, it drives me crazy. As a geneticist, it drives me crazy because my ancestry does not tell me who I am in a very cut and dried sort of way, right? It informs who I am, but also my cultural upbringing and a whole bunch of other factors go into my identity. And when you look at Indigenous Americans, that's a very special case because of the history of contact and genocide and admixture with all these outside groups. Native Americans today are genetically, they derive their ancestry from many different populations, including the people who were here before Columbus, but also from other populations as well. And when we say your Native American genes, we're racializing this, right? We should be looking at contemporary Native Americans, looking at, say, a tribe and say, okay, what is the genetic diversity present in this tribe? That's what it is. That's what Native American genetics is, right? Not trying to have this sort of static representation that extends back in the past. Because when we racialize this, we're imposing an improper category and to living populations, and we're pretending as if they don't exist in some sense, right? And then this also opens the door to a lot of people who are trying to seek tribal affiliation through genetics. And as Kim writes about quite a bit, that is really inappropriate because it's not, being Native American is a socio-cultural category as well as a genetic category, right? It's constructed. And I'm not explaining this as well as you would, but it's multifaceted, and you have to be part of a tribal community in order to belong to that tribe. You can't just say, oh, I've got, haplogroup B, therefore I should be part of the tribe. It just doesn't work that way. And it's insulting to Native Americans' principles of sovereignty and self-determination to try to use genetics to assert an identity like that.
So I have a question that I don't know where this falls into the discussion, but it dawned on me while you're talking. Can we tell to which tribe a certain genetic profile belongs to? Is it possible to break it down that much, or?
It isn't, at least not with current data.
Okay. So that makes that Native American claim even more fishy because.
Yes.
You don't know to which group you supposedly, quote unquote, belong either.
Right. Exactly. And, you have, you can look at general regional patterns, right? You can say, okay, we see haplogroup A. We're just talking mitochondrial here. It gets much more complicated when you look at the nuclear genome. You can be more precise with the nuclear genome, but it still doesn't break down neatly into tribal categories, right? The only thing you can say really is okay, I can see a trend of, increasing or decreasing frequencies of this haplogroup or this allele, which I haven't even defined yet.
Yeah, but, we won't go into alleles today.
Yeah, we'll not do that. This is the 101. but these genetic markers do not map neatly onto tribes, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but tribal history being one of them. So.
Well, this has sort of become the kind of the modern day equivalent of, well, gee, you don't look Indian, which has been, rife in Native American communities. A bunch of years ago, I was at Plymouth Plantation, which is a replica village of the 1620 Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. And they have a group of people there who are Wampanoag Indians. They are culturally Wampanoag. They historically trace themselves back to the native tribes who were there when the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts. There's been a lot of intermarriage between them and other groups, and they have a number of Wampanoags are working at the village. And the day I was there was a young man who was dressed as his ancestor did, and he was making a fire, and his skin was very dark, and he had curly hair. And I remember the people watching him, and I heard these two people talking, and one of them turned to the other and said, "It's too bad they couldn't find any real Indian to play that part."
Yeah.
And you wanted to
oh my
God. And this is a kid, a kid, he's probably a teenager, who very clearly, culturally, historically, he's a Wampanoag Indian. The fact that his skin is darker than you expect it to be, and that he doesn't have stereotypical long, straight black hair, you're going to say to that kid, you're not really an Indian? It's just absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
Well, it's that whole concept that I can look at someone and determine what they are by looking at them.
Well,
right.
Again, we don't want to get into politics, but
yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking too.
But the Pequot tribe, the Mashantucket Pequot, who have a very successful casino in Connecticut, when they sent their representatives to Washington, D.C. to apply for privilege of having a casino because we're an Indian tribe now, I remember very clearly that Donald Trump testified before a congressional committee complaining that you're going to let them open a casino? They don't look Indian to me. And so this is something that at least you need to take into consideration.
Well, the same things have been said about Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is actually part of a tribe. Like, she's legitimately a tribal member. And
is she?
Yeah. Yeah, she was claimed by the tribe that she said she was from.
Cherokee? I wasn't sure.
I don't remember what tribe she said she was from, but she
said she's Cherokee.
Yeah, well then the Cherokee stepped forward and said, yeah, she's one of ours, because when all of the crap started coming down on her, one of the tribal elders stepped forward and said, no, she's one of ours. So it's just
what's really interesting though, it applies here, is that somebody somewhere, I believe it was the Republican Party, said, we can clear this up in a hurry. Let's apply a DNA test to Elizabeth Warren and we'll show she's not an Indian. So
but that's not how that works.
But that's exactly what somebody said. They said,
I know.
But again, it shows how this notion that genetics and ethnicity are one-to-one correspondence, and all you need is a drop of blood or a little bit of saliva, and I can tell you where in the world you're from and what race you are. And that's kind of awful that people believe that.
Well, I like the term that Jennifer
genetics
used.
Trumps a tribal knowledge.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this idea that genetics trumps tribal knowledge and tribal self-determinism, right? It is not for geneticists to tell tribes who gets to be Native American. Right. It's for the tribe themselves to decide. We should have nothing to do with it. And I mean, I guess that's a political statement too, but it's true. I mean, it's not our place to say that.
Right.
We have other questions that we are concerned with. So yeah, that's my soapbox.
You can claim that you're Native American, and that isn't, to me, that's not the issue. The claiming of the Native Americanness. It's the I am Native American, therefore you should let me join your tribe, and I should get all of the rights and privileges thereof. And it's just, that's where it gets squibby for me, because you can go around and claim you're anything you want to be if you want. I can't stop you. But I don't think at that point, and genetics should not be playing the role of your, like you said, your trump card for you to be able to walk up to an actual ethnic group and say, you have to accept me because my genetics say blank. They don't have to accept you.
Is the phrase trump card a play on words here, or is that a little bit of a...
No!
I'm just asking. Well, that's, we've talked about on this podcast, we did a podcast devoted to the Lighthouse site. The site that I've excavated in the past. And we, the folks who are the members of that family, the descendants of white woman and a Narragansett Indian man from the mid-18th century, they look, there's a range of colors, of hair types, of body types, of eye colors, but nevertheless, I have a genealogy where I can put every one of those people on that genealogy. And, personally, I don't it doesn't make any difference to me if you call them Indian, not call them Indian. They're all members of a family, and they descended from a white woman and an Indian man. And nobody has the right to tell those people what they are. They're the ones who decide what they are.
Exactly.
And the genealogy proves that. And I don't give a shit about a DNA test because it doesn't mean anything when these people can say, here's where I fit in a lineage. And that guy was my great-great-grandfather, and the rest of that doesn't really mean much, at least in terms of defining who we are as a family.
Well, no, because, and I think this is something that Jennifer's tried to get at, ethnicity isn't genetics. Ethnicity is how you were raised, where you were raised, who you were raised around, your social and your cultural experience. And no amount of DNA is going to give you that. And so how you can claim to be an ethnic group based on genetics it's a sign of ignorance. And I think we've become, as a society, far too focused on genetics. And that goes back to forensics and all that, because of the whole DNA trumps everything, and now we're finding that DNA doesn't trump everything. It's not the end-all be-all. You can do it wrong, and just because your genetics are present somewhere doesn't mean anything in the long run. It could be there for a myriad of reasons. And same thing in your genetic history. And it's super complicated, as Jennifer has said, and it's not just a simple, here's a readout, here's who you are. Right.
You don't need somebody in a lab charging you $100 to tell you who you are.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer,
which is not to say that it's not fun to participate in these tests, right? I don't, because I can sequence my own genome, right? So I don't need to worry. But it is fun for people. But you just have to take it with a grain of salt and understand what it can tell you and what it can't tell you, right? And also pay attention to what they're using your DNA for after you take the study, because there are some companies that will use it for commercial reasons, like drug development, and you should just know that going in. You should know that read the fine print.
So it's kind of like a cross between your personality test and your star signs. It's fun.
Some people do refer to it as genetic astrology, and I think that's a really great.
I think that's a perfect. Yeah.
Well, there was an article, I think it's Scientific American. It was online, of a journalist who actually he got some lab to do his complete genome, which he says now costs only about $3,000.
Oh, only.
And but then sat down with the scientists, the biomedical scientists who actually did the genome, and talked about but very, very specifics about what tendencies there were for certain diseases. But what they were saying is that this is so much more meaningful than taking a little cheek swab and having them do this little tiny test, which really doesn't tell you much of anything at all.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's Carl Zimmer. He's doing a really great series on, I think he's calling it Game of Genomes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. Yeah, it was a really interesting article.
So, Jennifer, you got any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Well, there's a whole lot more I would love to talk about, but I guess we're out of time. So thanks for having me on. And if anybody would like to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter, my name, @JenniferRaff. And also my blog is violetmetaphors.com. So if you want to,
which is an excellent blog, by the way.
Yeah. I post there. I try and post about once a month. It's been kind of slow because I'm busy this summer, but I'm going to try and get some new articles out soon. Yeah. So
recommend it super highly. It's absolutely an awesome blog. Go and read it. And we will put the link up to the article that Jennifer wrote with Deborah Bolnick about the genetics behind the Solutrean hypothesis. That was in response to that other article, and that's a very, very, very valuable article. You want to understand what the objections are to the interpretation of the X haplogroup, indicating that people in North America came from Europe. That's the place to go to.
And it is open access, so you guys should be able to download it for free. Let me know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for being on the show, despite internet difficulties that we apparently were having.
Yeah. This has been awesome, Jennifer. This is why I love doing this podcast, because we meet so many really interesting, brilliant people. And just thank you for bringing that to the show.
Oh, thanks. I would love to be on anytime you guys have a genetics problem.
No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archaefantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archaefantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaefantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaefantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.